There are shows that try to make you feel tough. And then there are shows that look you dead in the eye and ask, very quietly, what do you do with the part of you that never came home? That's the energy I got from the premise of The Veteran's Promise, and I'm not gonna lie to you, it hit me like a slow punch to the ribs. Because on paper, it sounds like a crowd pleaser. A former soldier builds a new life, keeps his head down, tries to be normal, and then the past calls in a way you can't ignore. A fallen brother's widow and daughter get threatened, one phone call goes out, and 200 veterans answer. That's a fantasy, right? A righteous swarm. A brotherhood that still works. But the reason that premise is so potent is because it's also a grief story wearing combat boots. And yeah, welcome back to Bongo Gaming. I know, the channel name makes it sound like I'm about to review a loot box, but no, we're talking drama today, and I'm in my feelings about it. If you enjoy these long, rambling, slightly too invested drama deep dives, feel free to subscribe to Bongo Gaming so you don't miss the next one. Also, quick spoiler vibe check before we get messy. I'm going to keep this pretty spoiler light. I'll talk about the setup, the tone, the kinds of choices it makes, and the emotional trajectory you can expect, but I'm not here to ruin the big swings or the final outcomes for you. Now, here's what hooked me right away about The Veteran's Promise: it isn't just men with skills assemble. It's men with scars assemble, and those are not the same story. The difference is everything. Skills are cool. Skills are action. Scars are consequence. Scars mean the show has the opportunity to be about the price of violence even when violence is framed as protective, noble, or necessary. And the part that really got my attention is that it's not his own wife or his own kid that gets threatened, at least in the premise. It's his fallen brother's family. That detail matters. Because that's guilt. That's debt. That's the kind of obligation you can never fully repay, and the show is basically saying, what if a man tried to pay it anyway? There's also something quietly dangerous about the idea of 200 veterans mobilizing on a single phone call. A lot of action dramas would treat that like the coolest thing ever, like a flex, like a goosebumps moment, and that's it. But a drama that actually wants to have teeth would ask the uncomfortable follow-up questions. Who are these men now? What does answering look like in civilian life? Are they stable? Are they lonely? Are they aching for purpose? Are they the kind of people who have been waiting for an excuse to feel useful again? Because if you're honest about it, 200 battle-hardened veterans show up is not just power. It's volatility. And I know some of you are already thinking, okay, but is it just revenge porn with flags and slow motion? Fair question. I had the same worry. Premises like this can tip into propaganda-ish hero worship really fast, where every veteran is a saint, every civilian is either a victim or a villain, and violence is always framed like a clean solution. But here's where it gets interesting: the premise itself sets up a moral trap. You can't do, because you don't come after a hero's family and expect to walk away, without also flirting with the idea that heroes get to operate outside the rules. And if the show is brave, it will let that flirtation turn into a problem. Not a twist, not a gimmick, but a genuine question. What happens when your sense of justice is forged in a place where laws weren't protecting anyone, and you bring that mindset home? Let me paint the opening sequence as I imagine it lands when it's done right, because this is one of those premises where the first 10 minutes can tell you exactly what kind of show you're in for. You start with normal. Not happy sitcom normal, more like that tense, carefully managed normal. The kind of normal where you can tell the lead character has a routine that's less about living and more about staying contained. He wakes up early. He keeps his space tidy. He doesn't linger in mirrors. There's a stiffness to him that reads like discipline until you realize it might actually be fear of what happens if he loosens his grip. Then the call comes. And I don't mean the dramatic, perfectly timed call where the music swells and the camera does a heroic push-in like we're watching a recruitment ad. I mean the ugly kind of call. The call that interrupts a breath. The call that makes a man's face go flat because he can't afford to react until he knows exactly what this is. You hear a woman trying not to cry. You hear a kid in the background, maybe not even understanding yet. And the lead doesn't say much at first, because real panic doesn't always sound like shouting. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a man saying, "Tell me where you are," like he's trying to keep his voice steady for her because if she hears him break, she'll break harder. And then comes the promise. Maybe it's literally spoken, maybe it's just implied. But you can feel it click into place. The thing he's been avoiding. The part of him that was built for this exact kind of moment. Now imagine the phone call after that. The one he makes. Not to the police. Not to a lawyer. Not to a powerful politician buddy. He calls them. The old network. The men who know what he means without him having to explain it. And what I love about that as a narrative device is how fast it can go from brotherhood to mob, depending on how it's filmed and how it's written. If you show the call like a superhero summoning sequence, it's triumph. If you show it like a relapse, it's tragedy. Same action, totally different emotional truth. And I'm telling you, the difference between a good version of this show and a forgettable one is whether the creators understand that. The premise says 200 veterans answer without hesitation, and that line is doing a lot of emotional labor. Without hesitation sounds heroic. It also sounds like men who don't have anything else. Or men who have been waiting for someone to tell them what to do again. Or men who still think of loyalty as the only clean thing left in their lives. So when people ask me what kind of drama this is, I describe it as an action-driven moral melodrama. It's not just about whether they can protect the widow and daughter. It's about what protection turns into when it's fueled by grief and resentment and the old language of war. And we need to talk about that widow and daughter element, because this is where I get picky. A lot of stories like this accidentally turn the women and the child into pure props. They become the reason men get to be intense. They become plot fuel. The best version of the veteran's promise would not do that. The best version would let the widow have agency, fear that turns into strategy, anger that doesn't get neatly packaged as, "Please save me." Let the daughter be more than a symbol. Let her be a person who is watching all these men arrive with their energy, their history, their stiffness, their protectiveness, and feeling something complicated about it. Because if you're a kid and suddenly 200 hardened strangers show up because of you, that's terrifying. Even if they are there to help. Especially if they are there to help. Kids can sense when adults are vibrating with barely controlled violence. And if the show leans into that discomfort, it becomes something more than a power fantasy. It becomes a story about how violence, even righteous violence, changes the temperature of a room. It changes how people breathe. Let's linger on the lead character for a second, because here's the hinge the whole series swings on. The premise frames him as someone who built a new life after the military, and I'm always fascinated by how dramas portray that. Do they romanticize the civilian reset like it's a clean slate? Or do they portray it like a performance? I personally prefer when it's a performance. When you can tell he's doing everything right, but it's the kind of right that's brittle. He goes to work, he pays bills, maybe he even smiles at neighbors, but there's an emotional no-go zone inside him where his brother's death lives. And the moment the widow and daughter are threatened, that no-go zone becomes the only place he can operate from. The show's title, The Veteran's Promise, is also sneaky, because it's not The Veteran's Revenge or The Veteran's War. A promise is softer language. It's domestic language. It's the language of vows and family and "I'll be there." But a promise can become a weapon if you let it. A promise can justify anything. And if you're still with me, this is the question I kept turning over in my head: does the show let the promise stay sacred, or does it interrogate it? Does it show the lead becoming more himself, or less himself, as he tries to keep it? Because here's my contrarian take, and I can already hear some comments loading as I say it. I don't automatically think the 200 veterans thing is empowering. It can be. It can be cathartic, especially if you've ever felt like institutions failed you and you just want to see people show up and do something. I get that. I really do. But a mass mobilization of traumatized, trained men is also frightening. And I think a lot of viewers, especially viewers who are used to action being framed as clean and cool, might not realize how close that is to horror if the camera chooses to see it that way. That doesn't mean veterans are scary. It means unresolved trauma plus group dynamics plus righteous purpose is a volatile cocktail. The show has a chance to be honest about that, and I hope it takes it. And look, I'm going to be real with you for a second. The line, 200 battle-hardened veterans answer without hesitation, made me unexpectedly emotional. Like, I felt it in my throat. Because there's something painfully beautiful about being able to call for help and actually getting it. No bureaucracy. No, sorry, we can't do anything. Just people moving. People choosing you. But that beauty is exactly why this premise can hurt you if the writing is sharp. Because if you build a story on the fantasy of reliable brotherhood, you can also break that fantasy on screen. You can show the cracks. The ego. The old rivalries. The different ways they processed the same war. The ones who came back and tried to heal versus the ones who came back and stayed half feral inside. And that's the kind of interpersonal drama I want from this setup. Not just faceless backup. This is also where casting and performance become everything, because an ensemble of 200 is, obviously, not going to be 200 fully developed characters. So you have to make choices. You need a handful of key faces who represent different responses to war and to civilian life. You need the guy who's calm to the point of being eerie, like his emotions got locked away in a box years ago and he forgot where he put the key. You need the guy who jokes too much, because humor is the only way he can keep the darkness from crawling up his spine. You need the guy who is visibly trying, like genuinely trying, to be a good person now, and he's terrified that answering this call will undo years of progress. And you absolutely need at least one character who makes you uncomfortable, because real groups have that person. The one who takes it too far. The one who confuses protection with domination. The one who is way too excited to have a mission again. If the show sanitizes that, it's weaker. If it includes it and treats it seriously, it gets stronger. Now, visually, this is the kind of drama where the palette and camera language can either elevate the material or accidentally expose it. If it's shot like glossy action content, the emotional weight won't stick. It'll feel like a video game cutscene. But if it leans into grounded texture, you can make the smallest moments feel heavy. I'm talking about the look of cheap fluorescent lights in a community center where they meet up. The sound of boots on a gym floor. The way a man's shoulders tense when someone slams a car door too hard. The kind of close-ups where you're not looking for tears, you're looking for micro-reactions, the tiny flickers of memory that cross a face before it gets covered back up. And editing rhythm matters too. A show like this should know when not to cut. Let awkward silences sit. Let a stare linger one beat longer than comfortable. Because a lot of veterans in fiction are portrayed as either stoic superheroes or broken messes. The more interesting portrayal is someone who is functional, but haunted. Someone who can absolutely do what needs to be done, and that's exactly the problem. And if the show has any sense, it will use sound design as much as it uses music. You can do so much with muffled ringing, distant fireworks, the sudden absence of ambient noise when someone dissociates. Sometimes the most chilling choice is not a dramatic score, but no score at all. Just breath and fabric and the faint whine of a street light. Just when you think this is going to be a straightforward, protect the family narrative, the premise hints at something else, the idea of legacy. This is a fallen brother's widow and daughter. Meaning, the brother is not here to be the hero of his own story. He's a memory. He's an absence that shapes everything. That opens up the possibility for flashbacks, yes, but more importantly, it opens up the possibility for disagreement about who he really was. Because families remember the dead differently. Brothers in arms remember the dead differently. A widow might remember tenderness, patience, the softer domestic side that never shows up in war stories. The unit might remember competence, rage, sacrifice, the version of him that existed under pressure. And the lead character is stuck between those versions. He wants to honor all of them. He can't. No one can. If the show is smart, it will let that tension breathe. It will let the widow resent the way the veterans talk about her husband like he belonged to them. It will let the veterans feel awkward around her because they don't know how to be gentle. It will let the daughter have her own relationship to her father's myth, which is never as simple as the adults want it to be. I'm going to say something that might sound weird for an action-leaning drama review, but bear with me. The most important relationship in this story might not be the lead and the villains. It might not even be the lead and the widow. It might be the lead and the memory of his brother. Because you can do a whole arc where the lead keeps escalating for them, and gradually realizes he's not doing it for the widow and daughter anymore. He's doing it to fix something he can't fix. He's doing it to prove something. He's doing it because if he fails this, then his brother's death becomes even more unbearable. That's juicy drama. That's the kind of internal engine that can sustain a series beyond the initial hook. Now, since I'm staying spoiler light, I'm not going to pretend I can point to specific later reveals, but I can talk about what the narrative escalation almost has to look like if it's going to feel satisfying. At first, the threat is personal. Someone is targeting the widow and daughter. It feels like a contained situation. But to justify the scale of response, the show has to widen the lens. Either the threat is bigger than it seemed, or the response becomes bigger than it should be. And those are two very different directions. If the threat is bigger, you're in conspiracy territory. You're in, the institution is compromised, territory. You're in, someone powerful wants them silenced, territory. That can be thrilling, but it can also get generic fast if it turns into faceless suits doing faceless evil. If the response becomes bigger than it should be, you're in character tragedy territory. You're in, we crossed a line, territory. You're in, we brought war home, territory. That, to me, is the braver choice. And I'll be honest, I'm always hoping dramas pick the braver choice, even when it makes me uncomfortable. Especially when it makes me uncomfortable. Because discomfort is where themes live. So let's talk themes, because The Veteran's Promise is basically holding a bunch of big questions out in front of us like lit matches. What does loyalty mean after the context that defined it is gone? What does justice look like when you don't trust the system to deliver it? Is it noble to protect someone at all costs, or is, at all costs, the part where you lose your soul? And maybe the biggest one, can you actually build a new life after war, or are you just building a house on top of a sinkhole? A show doesn't need to answer all of that cleanly. In fact, if it answers too cleanly, I get suspicious. I want it to wrestle. I want it to argue with itself. Some of the best dramas feel like the writers are fighting in the room. Not in a messy way, but in a, we know this is complicated and we're not going to pretend it isn't, way. Here's another thing I'm watching for in a story like this: does it respect civilians as characters, or does it treat them like background furniture? Because one of the easiest mistakes is to portray the civilian world as weak and naive, and the veterans as the only competent adults in the room. That's flattering, sure, but it's not honest. Civilian strength looks different. Civilian courage looks different. The widow doesn't need to pick up a gun to be brave. She might be brave in the way she keeps her kid calm. In the way she negotiates with people she doesn't trust. In the way she refuses to be turned into a symbol. And if the show gets that right, it avoids the trap of turning this into a one-note masculinity parade. Speaking of masculinity, yeah, we have to go there. A series about brotherhood and violence and promises is always also about masculinity. About the scripts men inherit for how to love, how to grieve, how to protect, how to ask for help without feeling weak. The premise literally says, one phone call changes everything, and I'm fascinated by that, because asking for help is, in its own way, vulnerability. It's admitting you can't handle it alone. But the kind of help he asks for is also telling. He doesn't ask for comfort. He asks for action. That's a very specific emotional language. It's the language of, I don't know how to sit with pain, so I'm going to move. And that can be sympathetic and heartbreaking. It can also be dangerous. Again, that's the tightrope. There's a moment I can already picture, and if the show doesn't have something like this, it's leaving money on the table emotionally. Imagine the widow watching the lead character for the first time since the funeral. The last time she saw him, he was probably in uniform, probably standing stiff, probably saying the right words like he memorized them. Now he's in her space, in civilian clothes, but the war is still in his posture. He looks at her daughter and his face softens for half a second, and then hardens again, like softness is a luxury he doesn't trust. And the widow clocking that. Clocking that this man is both her safest option and potentially her biggest risk. That tension is electric when actors can play it. Because performance-wise, the lead needs an actor who can do restraint without being blank. There's a difference. Blank is nothing. Restraint is pressure you can feel. It's the sense that the emotion is there, it's just being held down by force. The widow needs an actor who can do layered fear without turning it into constant trembling. The daughter needs to feel like a kid, not a tiny adult delivering wise lines. If the kid is too written, you lose reality instantly. And the ensemble veterans need variety. I don't need them all to be lovable. I need them to feel like different lives. Different levels of healing. Different degrees of damage. If the show pulls that off, the 200 won't feel like a gimmick. It'll feel like a community. A flawed one, but a real one. And here's the part I'm curious about, because it's where shows like this either level up or play it safe. What does the antagonistic force look like? The premise says the widow and daughter are threatened, but threatened by who changes everything. If it's a random street gang, the drama becomes more straightforward, more vigilante. If it's a powerful network, the drama becomes more paranoid, more systemic. If it's someone tied to the brother's past, it becomes more intimate and more psychologically cruel. Whatever it is, I need the villains to have specificity. Not just bad guys doing bad. If the antagonists are too cartoonish, then the veteran's response feels automatically justified, and the show loses the moral friction that makes it interesting. Moral friction is the whole meal here. Without it, it's just noise. And you know what, let me do a quick aside before I get too serious, because I can feel myself going into full, why this matters, mode. You ever start a show thinking, I'll just watch the first episode to see if it's good, and then suddenly you're sitting there at 3 AM like, I guess this is my life now, with the brightness turned all the way down and your snack choices getting progressively more unhinged. This premise is built for that kind of binge trap. One phone call, one mobilization, one escalation, and your brain goes, okay, but what happens if, and suddenly you're 5 episodes deep. Anyway, back to the emotional damage. The reason audiences flock to stories like this is because they offer a clean fantasy in a messy world. The fantasy that if you mess with the vulnerable, someone strong will show up. The fantasy that brotherhood means something. The fantasy that there are lines you don't cross. But dramas get great when they complicate fantasies without mocking the people who need them. So if the veteran's promise is doing its job, it's going to give you the catharsis and then make you examine the cost. It's going to let you cheer and then make you swallow that cheer a little when you realize what you're actually cheering for. There's a particular kind of scene that does this well, and it doesn't even need to be action. Picture a room. The veterans have gathered somewhere unglamorous, like a warehouse or a back room of a bar that's trying to be a community space. They're talking logistics, sure. But then someone brings up the fallen brother. Someone says his name, and the room shifts. It gets quiet in that way groups get quiet when they are all remembering something they don't share with outsiders. The lead character listens, and you can see him counting the faces. Who showed up? Who didn't? Who looks older than they should? Who looks like they never recovered? And for a split second, it hits him that by making this call, he didn't just summon warriors. He summoned ghosts. Living ghosts. If the show can land that feeling, it's already doing more than most. Let's talk pacing, because pacing in a premise like this is tricky. You have the inciting incident, the call, the assembly. That's your early surge. Then you need the middle engine. The middle is where a lot of action dramas get repetitive, where it becomes threat of the week, or fight of the week, without emotional progression. The best way to keep it alive is to shift the focus from external threats to internal fractures as the story goes on. Let the group dynamics become part of the conflict. Let the widow's trust become a slow negotiation. Let the daughter's sense of safety become a moving target. Let the lead character's self-image start to crack as he realizes he's not just protecting, he's controlling. Because control is the shadow side of protection, and a show with this title has to be aware of that. And I'll tell you what I'm hoping for, genuinely. I'm hoping the series allows moments of softness that aren't treated like weakness. Quiet dinners. A kid laughing. A veteran holding back tears in a hallway because he heard a lullaby through a door and it reminded him of something he lost. Those moments are the contrast that makes the darker stuff land. Without contrast, everything is just the same shade of grim. Now, if we're talking cinematography again in a more general sense, I always love when shows like this use thresholds as visual language. Doorways. Gates. Car windows. The frame within the frame. Because the whole story is about crossing from civilian life into war logic. Every time a character steps through a door, the question is, which world are they in now? And editing can echo that, too. Cut from a calm domestic space to a sudden tactical conversation. Cut from a child's face to a veteran's clenched jaw. Cut from a soft sound to a harsh one. That's how you make the show feel like it's oscillating between two realities. The music, if it's smart, won't overplay heroism. Give me a motif that feels like memory, not like victory. Give me something that sounds like a promise being made, not a battle being won. Even a simple repeated chord progression can become devastating if it's tied to the fallen brother's presence, like whenever someone invokes him, the music isn't swelling, it's haunting. Because the brother isn't a banner. He's a wound. And speaking of wounds, this is where I want to be careful, because shows about military trauma can either be thoughtful or exploitative. The premise could allow for a nuanced look at PTSD, moral injury, survivor's guilt, and the weird whiplash of returning to a society that wants to thank you and forget you at the same time. But it can also reduce all that into aesthetic. The 1,000-yard stare. The sudden violence. The "only war makes sense" cliché. If the show is serious, it will let trauma be inconsistent. It'll let a character be fine one day and not fine the next. It'll let healing be non-linear. It'll let someone do the right thing for the wrong reasons. And that's what I mean when I say I want it to argue with itself. Because the easiest version is, they are heroes, the bad guys are bad, the family is saved, roll credits. The harder version is, they are heroes and also they are dangerous and also they are wounded and also they are trying, and you can love them and fear them at the same time. That's compelling television. Let me circle back to that tagline energy again, because you don't come after a hero's family and expect to walk away. It's a fist pump line. It's also a threat. And I love when a show lets you feel both readings at once. Because if you frame it as a threat, suddenly the question becomes, who is this threat for? The villains, obviously. But also the widow. Also the daughter. Also the community around them who didn't ask for a private army to move into their neighborhood. That's when the show can start exploring the ripple effects. Neighbors get scared. Local law enforcement gets defensive. Media attention possibly becomes a factor. People start choosing sides, and not all of those sides are moral, some are just convenient. And that's the kind of escalation that makes a series feel bigger without needing explosions every episode. I can already imagine a scene where a veteran tries to do something kind, something normal, like buying the daughter an ice cream, and he's so out of practice at normal kindness that it comes out awkward, too intense. He stands too close. He watches the street too hard. He scares the cashier without meaning to. And the daughter senses it and goes quiet, and the veteran's face falls because he realizes he's frightening the person he wanted to protect. Those small humiliations are important. They keep the show human. And this is where my personal reaction comes in again, because I have a soft spot for stories about found family and loyalty, but I also get frustrated when loyalty is treated like a blank check. So if the veteran's promise is the kind of show that says, loyalty above all, I'm going to push back. But if it's the kind of show that says, loyalty is beautiful and it's also messy and it can ruin you, then I'm right there. The premise really does suggest that messy version, especially because it's rooted in loss. A fallen brother isn't just a motivation, he's a constant silent judge. Every decision the lead makes can feel like it's being measured against someone who's not alive to disagree. And you know what's heartbreaking? The lead might be chasing a version of his brother that doesn't even exist. He might be trying to honor a myth because the reality is too complicated. That's what grief does. It simplifies. It edits. So what I want from the writing is the courage to edit. To let the brother's memory be complex. To let someone admit that the brother wasn't perfect. To let someone say, quietly, he would hate what we're doing, and have that land like a grenade in the middle of the group. Because that's the thing about promises. You can keep them in a way that betrays what they were supposed to mean. And if you're wondering whether this show can sustain tension for a full season or multiple arcs, it absolutely can, as long as it doesn't rely solely on bigger and bigger threats. Tension can come from the clock, yes, like, we have to get them out before, but it can also come from trust erosion. When you have 200 people in motion, coordination becomes its own story. Information gets distorted. Somebody takes initiative when they shouldn't. Somebody hesitates when they should act. And every time the group moves, the risk of collateral damage rises. That, to me, is the real suspense. Not, can they win, but, what will winning cost, and who will pay it? The next layer, and I'm really curious if the show goes there, is what new life means in the first place. The premise says he built one. Built implies effort. Built implies something that can be torn down. Was his new life a family? A job? A quiet town? A relationship he's been trying to keep healthy? A routine that keeps him sober? Whatever it is, the moment he makes that call, he's gambling it. And that's an under-discussed piece of these stories. When the hero answers the call, everybody around him pays. If he has a partner, they are suddenly dating a different person. If he has friends, they are suddenly watching him disappear into an old version of himself. If he has a community, they are suddenly dealing with the fallout. That's where the drama can get intimate and painful. Okay, I want to zoom in on something that might sound small, but it's not. The phrase, without hesitation. I keep coming back to it because it's a romanticization of decisiveness. And decisiveness is sexy on TV. It's clean. It's satisfying. But in real human terms, hesitation is where conscience lives. Hesitation is where you picture consequences. Hesitation is where you imagine your kid seeing you on the news. So when the show says they answer without hesitation, I hear two possible readings. Either they are so noble and loyal that they don't need to think. Or they are so habituated to violence as a solution that thinking has become optional. If the show leans into that ambiguity, it's going to be memorable. And if it doesn't, if it just plays it straight, it might still be entertaining, but it will also be flatter. It'll be the kind of show you binge and forget. Whereas the better version is the one that lingers, the one that makes you sit there afterward like, wait, was I supposed to cheer for that? That's the sweet spot. I've been talking a lot about what I hope the show does, and that's because the premise is doing a ton of heavy lifting. So let me ground it again in what the story is clearly aiming at emotionally: protection as devotion, devotion as identity. This guy never forgot the men he fought beside. That line implies he's been carrying them around like a second spine. Maybe he left the military, but the military didn't leave him. And the proof is how fast the phone tree lights up. And something about that is both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because it suggests real connection. Heartbreaking because it suggests he hasn't been able to attach that deeply to anything else since. So if the show gives us scenes where he tries to be normal and fails, not in a slapstick way, but in a quietly sad way, that will do more for his character than any fight choreography ever could. Like, imagine him at a child's birthday party. Somebody pops a balloon, and his whole body reacts before his brain catches up. He covers it with a smile, but you see the sweat on his temple. He steps outside and breathes like he's trying to remember where he is. And then his phone buzzes, and he looks relieved. Relieved. That's the tragedy in one image. The idea that danger feels simpler than safety. And if that image doesn't break your heart a little, I don't know what to tell you. Now, a lot of people are going to watch the Veterans Promise for the 200 veterans moment. The arrival. The solidarity. The intimidation factor. The sense that the villains messed with the wrong people. And listen, I'm not above that. Give me the line-up shot. Give me the quiet nods. Give me the sense of momentum. But the show can't just be the line-up shot. It has to earn it. It has to make the arrival feel like a choice with consequences, not just a mic drop. It has to show that when you call in that kind of force, you don't get to put it neatly back in the box afterward. And that's where the real drama is going to be, because once the veterans are there, the world has changed. Even if the family gets safe, the lead character can't unknow what it felt like to be needed again. The others can't unknow what it felt like to belong again. That's a temptation. That's the hook that could pull them back into cycles they swore they were done with. So the question becomes, what happens after the immediate threat is handled, or even just temporarily stabilized? Do they disperse? Do they linger? Do they start looking for new missions? Do they start projecting their need for purpose onto every problem they see? And that's a terrifying thought, honestly. Because this is how vigilantism spreads. Not through evil, but through addiction to meaning. There's a lot more to dig into with how a drama like this handles spectacle versus intimacy, and how it avoids turning trauma into an aesthetic while still delivering the catharsis people came for, and I want to sit with that balance a little longer, especially when we start thinking about how the series might portray the daughter's perspective as the story escalates and the veteran's presence becomes less like a shield and more like a storm cloud hanging over the household, because if the writing is even halfway honest, her sense of safety is going to get complicated fast, and that complication is where some of the most powerful scenes could live if the camera is willing to stay close enough to her face to let us see it happen in real time rather than rushing back to the next confrontation where the adults are doing adult things and pretending the kid isn't absorbing every single ounce of it all at once, at the same time, because the adults in this story are basically walking around like live wires. Even the well-intentioned ones. Especially the well-intentioned ones. And that's where a kid perspective becomes the secret weapon of a drama like this. Not in a cheesy, inspirational way. In a brutal, observational way. Kids don't have the language for moral injury, but they have an insanely accurate internal barometer for danger. They know when adults are lying. They know when tension is being swallowed. They know when the room is pretending to be safe. So if the Veterans Promise ever gives us scenes where the daughter is just sitting there, quietly clocking the way these men scan doorways, the way conversations stop when she walks in, the way her mom's smile turns into a different smile when the veterans show up, that's the stuff that can make the whole series feel sharper than the average, protect the innocent, plot. Because suddenly protection has a cost you can see. Not in blood. In childhood. Here's a moment I can picture so clearly it almost annoys me. Because if the show doesn't do it, I'll feel like it left a whole emotional lane unused. Imagine the veterans have been around the house for a while. They've set up their little informal perimeter. They think they're being subtle, but they are not. And the daughter goes to draw something. Kids draw what they see. She draws her home, but the home has these big, blocky shapes around it. Men like towers. A fence that wasn't there before. Maybe she draws her mom with a big smile, but she draws herself smaller than usual, tucked in a corner. And she doesn't even realize what she's confessing on paper. And the lead character sees it. Not in a dramatic, fall to his knees way. In that quiet way where he just freezes, like the air got pulled out of his lungs. Because he's been telling himself, and telling everyone, that this is making them safe. And then he realizes the kid feels caged. Safe, maybe, but caged. That's the kind of gut punch that tells you what your story is really about. And if you're thinking, okay, but is this show actually going to be that introspective? That's the tension, right? The premise could go either way. It could lean into a more grounded, morally complicated drama, or it could lean into crowd-pleasing intimidation and slick action. I will say, though, even in a more mainstream take, the premise still carries inherent emotion because it's built on one of the oldest narrative engines we have, the vow. A promise to the dead, or a promise in the name of the dead, is basically a haunted contract. It's a deal you can't renegotiate because the person you'd renegotiate with isn't here. And that's why this story can resonate even for people who aren't usually into military-adjacent dramas. You don't need to know anything about tactics to understand what it feels like to owe someone forever. But here's the pivot point where, for me, the show either becomes genuinely great or just very watchable. Does it show the veterans as a collective comfort blanket, or does it show them as individuals with different moral thresholds? Because 200 veterans is a cinematic flex, but it's also a writing challenge. The lazy approach turns them into a wall. The better approach turns them into weather. Some of them are calming. Some of them are storms. Some of them are unpredictable gusts that slam doors you didn't even realize were open. And the way you do that on screen is with small, human details. One guy refuses to go inside because he doesn't want to bring his energy into a child's space. Another guy insists on sitting with his back to the wall at dinner, and he won't explain it, and the widow tries not to stare because she doesn't want him to feel judged, but she also can't pretend it's normal. Another veteran keeps trying to talk to the daughter like she's an adult, because he can't handle kid energy, and the daughter doesn't like him because she can feel how uncomfortable he is, and then the lead has to step in and gently correct him, and you realize the lead is not just managing villains. He's managing his own people. That's drama. And the part that could really spike the tension is when those moral thresholds clash. Because if you have a group united by loyalty, the thing that splits them isn't usually, do we care? It's, how far are we allowed to go to prove we care? Some men will demand restraint, not because they're cowards, but because they've actually learned what escalation does. Some men will demand escalation because they mistake intensity for effectiveness. And the lead is standing in the center trying to hold the promise with both hands, like if he grips hard enough, it won't break. But promises don't work like that. Something else I want to talk about is how the show might handle the idea of a hero's family. That phrase is in the premise, and it's loaded. It implies the fallen brother has been mythologized. He is the hero. Therefore his wife and child are not just people, they are symbols. And symbols are dangerous, because the moment people start protecting a symbol, they stop listening to the person. If the widow says, "I want you gone," and the men respond with, "We can't leave you," that could be framed as devotion. It could also be framed as the widow losing control of her own life again, but this time to good guys. And you see how easily that becomes a story about consent. About autonomy? About the difference between being saved and being controlled? That's why I keep emphasizing, the best version of this series isn't just a "don't mess with us" fantasy. It's an exploration of what happens when strength is offered in a way that crowds out choice. And I'm going to be a little bold here. I actually think the widow should be allowed to dislike them sometimes. Not hate them. Not be ungrateful. But dislike them. Be irritated by their presence. Feel suffocated. Feel like she's living in a house full of men who all share a secret language that she'll never speak fluently. That's honest. And it makes the moments of genuine connection feel earned, not obligatory. Because then when one of the veterans does something sincerely kind, it lands harder. Not because, he's a softie, but because kindness from someone who is capable of violence carries weight. It's chosen. It's a decision. If the show nails that, it can make even quiet scenes feel like they have stakes. And since we're on the topic of quiet scenes, let's talk about the kind of signature moment that makes or breaks this type of drama for me. The first time the lead character and the widow are alone in a room and neither of them knows what to say. You'd think it would be easy. "Thank you for coming. I'm sorry. We'll keep you safe." The usual. But real grief doesn't flow in neat dialogue. Real grief is two people standing too far apart in a kitchen, the fridge humming, a clock ticking, child asleep down the hall, and both of them knowing the name of the dead man like it's a third person in the room. The widow doesn't want to cry in front of him because she's already cried in front of strangers at the funeral. The lead doesn't want to cry because he's trained himself not to. So they talk about something stupid like the lock on the back door, or the neighbor's dog, because talking about the dead man feels like stepping on a landmine. And then one of them finally says something real. Maybe it's the widow, maybe it's him. Something like, "He promised me he'd come home." And you see the lead flinch, because he heard that promise too, in a different context, from the same man, and neither promise got kept. That's the kind of scene that tells you whether your actors can carry the show even when nobody is punching anybody. And speaking of acting, I know I can't comment on specific casting for a 2026 show without making stuff up, so I'm not going to. But I can tell you the kind of performance this material requires. The lead needs someone with controlled intensity. Not stone-faced, not shouty. Controlled. An actor who can make stillness feel like a decision. Someone who can speak softly while making you feel the threat underneath, and then, in the same episode, look at a child and genuinely soften without turning it into a Hallmark ad. The widow needs someone who can play strength without becoming cold. She should feel like a person who is exhausted, who is scared, who is angry, and who still has to parent. The parenting detail is key. It's one thing to be afraid. It's another thing to be afraid while pretending you're not because your kid is watching. And the veterans as an ensemble need chemistry that feels like history, not just camaraderie. They should talk over each other sometimes. They should have inside jokes that aren't explained. They should have moments where they fall into old patterns without meaning to. That's what makes it believable. This is also where editing can help. Quick glances exchanged between men who understand each other's shorthand. A half-second shot of a hand tapping a knee too fast. The kind of micro-behavior that says, this person is managing a lot under the surface. If the director understands that trauma often lives in the body, not the dialogue, the show automatically becomes more textured. Now, let me swing back to the threat itself, because the premise frames it as the inciting fire, but the quality of your antagonistic force determines the quality of your moral questions. If the antagonists are just faceless cruelty, the show becomes a simple revenge and protection narrative, which can be fun. But it's not going to be the kind of thing I keep thinking about. The show needs antagonists who put pressure on the characters' values, not just their skills. In other words, the threat needs to force the veterans to make choices they can't cleanly justify. Maybe the antagonists hide behind legal structures. Maybe they use the system. Maybe they know that the veterans' biggest weakness is optics. The moment these men act, they can be painted as extremists. The moment they threaten violence, they can be criminalized. That's not a political statement, it's just reality. And it's a smart tension point for writing. Or maybe the antagonists are personal. Someone who has a connection to the fallen brother, which turns the whole protection mission into a confrontation with the past. That would be deliciously cruel, because now the lead isn't just defending the living, he's defending the dead man's legacy. And here's a question I'd love the show to ask: what if the fallen brother wasn't purely innocent in the chain of events that led to this threat? I'm not saying, twist villain. I'm not saying, gotcha. I'm saying, what if heroism has fallout? What if the brother made enemies because of something he did that was justified in war but messy in civilian terms? What if he stepped on powerful toes? What if he protected someone and, in doing so, put his family in a line of sight he never saw? That's not undermining the hero. That's treating him like a human being whose actions had consequences. And if the show goes anywhere near that territory, suddenly the title, The Veteran's Promise, becomes even more layered. Because now the promise isn't just, I'll protect your family. It's also, I'll keep believing you were good. And those are not always compatible. Hang on to that thought, because this is where a lot of dramas either become mature or become melodramatic. The mature route is letting characters live in contradiction. The melodramatic route is forcing a clean moral alignment that makes everyone either saintly or monstrous. And I'm telling you, a story about veterans deserves the mature route. Not because veterans are inherently special, but because the topic is inherently charged. People bring real feelings and real politics and real trauma to it. If the show plays it simplistic, it's going to feel like it's using the aesthetic of service without honoring the complexity of what service does to people. Okay. I want to talk about one more craft element that's easy to overlook but matters a lot here: production design. Where are we spending time? Are we in warm domestic spaces that gradually get invaded by tactical gear and surveillance vibes? Are we in anonymous industrial spaces that feel like the veterans are recreating the mission room energy because they don't know how else to function? Are we in public spaces like schools and grocery stores where the veteran's presence feels out of place, like a wolf trying to act like a golden retriever? Set design tells you what the show believes about the collision between civilian life and war logic. If the home stays cozy and unchanged even after the veterans arrive, the show is probably romanticizing their presence. If the home's vibe shifts, if the lighting gets colder, if corners get more shadowed, if the blocking starts to feel more controlled, then you're watching a show that understands the cost of militarizing a domestic space. Also, little details like where weapons are placed, where people stand, where the child is allowed to move, those choices are storytelling. And since I'm already in the weeds, let's talk about music again, because I've seen so many dramas ruin their own tension by overscoring. If every scene has epic music, none of it feels epic. If every confrontation has a bass drop, you stop believing in the danger because you feel the production trying to hype you. The strongest move, in my opinion, is to reserve big musical moments for emotional pivots, not physical ones. Use music when someone breaks, not when someone hits. Use it when the widow loses her patience, when the lead admits something ugly to himself, when the daughter finally says what she's been thinking. And for action scenes, let sound design do the work. Let footsteps sound too loud. Let fabric rustle. Let the click of a car lock feel like a gunshot. Silence can be terrifying if you trust it. And here's the rehook question that kept popping up for me while sitting with this premise: what happens to the lead character when the mission ends? Because if this is a series, not a 2-hour movie, the ending of the immediate threat can't be the end of the story's emotional engine. The real engine is what this mission does to him, and what it does to the group he reactivated. If he built a new life, then this is a rupture. A major one. A rupture can lead to growth, or it can lead to relapse. And that's a really honest thing to explore for people who have tried to move past something intense in their life. Not necessarily war, just anything that rewires you. Addiction, grief, violence, even just a past identity you can't fully shed. Sometimes you don't go back because you want to. You go back because the old you still fits like armor, and the new you still feels like a costume. If the veteran's promise understands that, it can do something really powerful with its lead. Let me offer another slightly contrarian angle, because I can already see the kind of fan discourse this show could spark. People are going to pick favorites among the veterans. They always do. The funny one, the cold one, the sweet one, the unhinged one. And I think the most important character might be the one everybody finds boring at first. The one who's constantly saying, we should slow down, we should think, we should involve proper channels, we should not terrify this kid. That character gets written off as a buzzkill in a lot of fandom spaces, and I get it. It's not as exciting. But in a story like this, that character is the conscience. That character is the future. That character is the guy who actually learned from the past instead of just surviving it. So if you end up watching this and you find yourself getting annoyed at the slow down character, I'm just saying, sit with that annoyance. The show might be doing something intentional. It might be showing you how seductive escalation is. Because escalation feels like control. Restraint feels like helplessness. Okay, quick personal confession time, because this premise hits a very specific nerve for me as a viewer. I have a hard time with stories where the good guys use intimidation as a love language. Like, I care about you, therefore I will terrify the world on your behalf. There's something undeniably satisfying about it, and that's exactly why it scares me. It's easy to clap when it's pointed at a villain. It's harder when you realize that same intensity doesn't turn off neatly. It leaks. So if this show leans into that leakage, it's going to make me respect it more even if it makes me uncomfortable. And if it doesn't, if it keeps everything neatly aimed at bad guys, I'll still probably enjoy the ride, but it won't feel as honest. Now, I want to do a more vivid mini-scene retelling that stays in early story territory, because I think it captures what could make the veteran's promise emotionally addictive even for people who don't care about tactical action. Picture this. The widow and daughter are in their home. It's evening. The kind of evening where you can hear the house settling, little creaks, the low hum of appliances. The daughter is doing something normal, maybe homework, maybe watching something, and the widow is trying to be present while her phone sits like a ticking bomb on the table. There's a knock. Not a loud, aggressive knock. A measured one. Like someone trying to be polite while also making it clear they'll knock again if you don't answer. The widow freezes. She doesn't tell her daughter to run because she doesn't want to scare her. She just moves, slowly, like she's walking through water. She peeks through the curtain. We don't even have to see the threat clearly. Maybe we see a silhouette. Maybe we see a hand. Maybe we just see the widow's face drain of color. Then, in the background, her phone buzzes. A text from the lead. Something simple. I'm close. Or, don't open the door. Or even just, I'm here. And the sound of that buzz, that tiny vibration, becomes louder than the knock. Because it's the sound of the promise arriving. Now, imagine the editing here. The camera stays on the widow's face. We see her make a decision. She doesn't open the door. She backs away. She gently moves her daughter behind her without explaining, just placing her body like a shield. The knock comes again. Harder. And then we hear something outside. Not gunfire, not a fight. Just footsteps. Multiple. The knock stops. A beat of silence so long it's almost unbearable. And then, a voice outside, calm, controlled, not shouting. A man speaking to another man like it's an instruction, not a threat. Low enough that it feels intimate. Like the whole world just got quieter to listen. The widow doesn't even exhale. She just closes her eyes for half a second, because relief and terror can look the same in the body. That's the kind of scene that can be shot without showing a single punch and still make your heart race. And that's why I'm excited by this premise. Because it has built-in tension that doesn't require constant spectacle. It requires control. Atmosphere. The sense that violence is possible, always hovering nearby, but not always unleashed. Now, one potential pitfall I want to flag, because this is where a lot of similar stories stumble even when they have great intentions. If the show leans too hard into hero worship, it risks flattening its own grief. The fallen brother becomes a perfect saint. The veterans become perfect protectors. The widow becomes perfect grateful victim. The daughter becomes perfect innocent. And real human beings are not perfect. Real grief is messy. Real protection can be suffocating. Real loyalty can be selfish sometimes. People can love you and still use you to fill a hole in themselves. If the show avoids those messier truths because it's afraid of making the heroes look bad, it will end up being less respectful, not more. Because respect isn't idealization. Respect is honesty. And if you're still with me, here's the next question that would make me lean forward in my chair. Does the show let the veterans disagree with the lead? Because the premise positions him as the one phone call that mobilizes everyone. That's leadership. But leadership is not the same as control. A good drama will challenge his authority. It'll show that some of these men don't see him as a king, they see him as a peer. Or they see him as someone who's making choices based on guilt rather than strategy. And that tension can become deeply personal, because if anyone is allowed to call him out, it's them. The civilian characters can criticize him, sure, but the veterans can cut deeper because they share the same language. They know what he's doing underneath what he's saying. So imagine a scene where he's insisting, "We're doing this my way," and one of the veterans looks at him and says something like, "Your way got your brother killed." Not to be cruel. To be honest. And then the lead has to either crumble, or double down, or evolve. That's character development. That's the kind of moment that separates a protagonist from a symbol. Let's also talk about the show's relationship to law enforcement and institutions, because that's another area where this kind of premise can become either thoughtful or kind of juvenile. If the police are portrayed as useless caricatures, it becomes easy to justify everything the veterans do. If the institutions are portrayed as complicated, with individual people trying within broken systems, it becomes harder. And harder is better drama. Maybe there's a local officer who genuinely wants to help but is outmatched. Maybe there's someone who recognizes the veterans and has complicated respect and fear. Maybe there's a tension between official process and immediate safety. Those dynamics can add layers without turning it into a political lecture. And if the show is really smart, it will show how institutions react to an unofficial force moving through their territory. Not just, oh no, cool guys, but actual pushback, surveillance, threats of legal consequences. And then the veterans have to decide if they care. Because if they don't care, then we're not just watching protectors. We're watching men who have decided the rules don't apply to them. Which, again, is compelling if the show is honest about it. Something else that could make the Veterans Promise stand out is if it explores the difference between wartime morality and civilian morality without treating one as superior. War has its own ethics. It has its own clarity sometimes. Civilian life is murkier. There's bureaucracy, there's ambiguity, there's compromise. People who lived in a world where decisions were immediate can find civilian delay intolerable. So if the lead character keeps getting frustrated by waiting, and the widow keeps insisting on caution because she has to live here after they leave, that's not just plot friction. That's two moral timeframes colliding. And the daughter is caught between them, because she needs safety now, but she also needs a future. Okay, I'm going to slow down for a second and talk about what I think the emotional arc of the lead has to be, at minimum, for the show to feel complete, without spoiling any specific ending. He starts with containment. He's built a new life. He's trying to be okay. Then the call drags him back into purpose. Purpose feels good. Purpose feels like relief. Then purpose starts turning into obsession. Obsession feels like righteousness. Then righteousness starts demanding sacrifices. Sacrifices feel like proof. And at some point, if the show is doing what I hope it's doing, he has to look at the wreckage around him and ask, what am I actually protecting? Them? Or my own need to not fail my brother again? That's the moment of truth. That's the moment that can break him open or harden him permanently. And I'll be real, I'm a sucker for a drama that lets a strong man realize he's been using strength to avoid grief. That realization can be one of the most cathartic things to watch, because it's not just about war. It's about anyone who stays busy so they don't have to feel. Now, one more light, human thing I want the show to include, because it makes the heavy stuff land. Let the veterans have mundane moments with each other. Let them bicker about stupid things. Let them tease each other. Let them fall into old dynamics that aren't about violence. Because the audience needs to believe they're real people worth caring about, not just a squad of vibes. And also, selfishly, those moments make the later tension more painful. When you've seen someone laugh, you feel it more when they go cold. I'm going to keep pulling on this thread of community, because the premise's scale implies a small society forming around the widow and daughter. 200 is a lot. Even if only a fraction are physically present at a time, the idea is, the network is wide. So what happens to the neighborhood? What happens to the local businesses? What happens to the school? If the kid goes to school, does she become that kid? The hero's daughter? The threatened daughter? The reason strange men are hanging around? If the show touches that, even lightly, it gains realism. It stops being a bubble and starts being a world. And here's a rehook that I think is crucial. What if the people threatening the widow and daughter want the veterans to show up? That's such a juicy possibility. Because then the mobilization isn't just a response, it's a trigger. It's bait. Again, I'm not claiming that's what happens. I'm saying it's the kind of narrative move that would add teeth. It would force the veterans to confront the fact that their presence is predictable. That their loyalty can be weaponized against them. And if you want to write a story about promises, that's a perfect nightmare. The idea that your devotion makes you controllable. So yeah, I'm fascinated by how the show might handle manipulation. Not just physical threat, but psychological threat. The kind that makes you question whether the promise itself is the thing endangering the family. Because if the villains can't overpower 200 veterans physically, they'll try to overpower them morally. They'll try to force them into an impossible choice. Protect the family or protect your own men. Protect the widow's safety or protect the daughter's innocence. Protect your public image or protect your private vow. Impossible choices are where drama gets spicy. Now, I want to touch on something that could be controversial depending on how the show frames it, the idea of collective masculinity as comfort. There's a warmth that can exist in groups of men who know each other deeply, who have been through something no one else understands. There's also a suffocation that can exist in it. A pressure to perform toughness. A pressure to suppress softness. A pressure to handle it, rather than talk about it. So if the show gives us even one scene where a veteran tries to be vulnerable and gets shut down, not maliciously, but reflexively, that would feel real. Like someone starts to say, "I can't sleep," and someone else responds with, "You're fine," because that's what they've always done, and the first guy just nods and swallows it. Those moments are small tragedies. And if the lead character is the kind of guy who encourages vulnerability, that's interesting. If he's the kind of guy who shuts it down because he can't handle it, that's also interesting. Either way, it tells you what kind of leader he is. One thing I don't want the show to do, though, is turn therapy into a punchline. I'm fine with jokes, I'm fine with characters being skeptical, that's realistic. But if the show treats healing as corny and violence as cool, it's going to age badly in my mind. And that's not me being preachy. It's me thinking about what actually makes stories resonate over time. The dramas we keep returning to are usually the ones that let characters try to become better, not just more effective. Okay, let's talk about tension building again, because I want to stay in the craft lane for a bit. A good show with this premise should understand spatial tension. Where are people positioned? Who controls the space? When the veterans arrive, do they take over the house? Do they post up in doorways? Do they stand between the widow and the outside world? Even if they mean well, those blocking choices communicate dominance. The widow's agency can be shown visually by whether she is allowed to move freely in her own home, or whether the camera keeps catching her stopping short because there's a man in her way, not intentionally blocking her, but existing there. And the daughter's agency can be shown by whether she's allowed to be in the frame as a participant in scenes, or whether she's constantly kept in the background, out of focus, like a symbol rather than a person. Little stuff. Big impact. Also, if the show wants to be truly tense, it should resist making every veteran competent in the same way. Competence is not a uniform. Some of them will make mistakes. Some will overreact. Some will underestimate the threat because they are overconfident. Some will freeze because civilian violence feels different than wartime violence. That's not disrespect. That's reality. And it gives you story. Now, I'm going to stop myself before I spiral into pure, "Here's how I would write this," because I can do that for hours and then suddenly we've accidentally turned this into my fanfiction pitch meeting. Instead, let me anchor back to what the premise promises emotionally: solidarity. The fantasy of solidarity. And I think the show's biggest job is to deliver that fantasy without making it shallow. To show solidarity as a force that can save people, but also as a force that can become insular, aggressive, and morally blinding. Because solidarity is not automatically good. It depends on what it's in service of. If it's in service of protecting the vulnerable, great. If it's in service of protecting the group's ego, not great. That's the knife edge. And if the series plays on that knife edge, you're going to have scenes where you don't know what to feel. You're going to have moments where you're proud of them and afraid of them in the same breath. You're going to have moments where you want the widow to accept the help and also want her to tell them to leave. That emotional conflict is addictive. It keeps you watching because you're not just waiting for plot, you're waiting to see who these people become under pressure. I'll leave you with this thought as we keep moving through the show's ideas, because it's the line that keeps echoing in my head: when you promise to protect someone, you're also promising to change their world. Even if you save their lives, you might change the shape of their life. You might change what home feels like. You might change what safety means. You might teach a child that safety looks like men with hardened eyes standing in corners. And the moment the show really earns its title is when it admits that out loud, when it lets the promise be beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and when it lets the lead character realize that keeping his brother's family alive is not the same thing as keeping them whole, because once you invite war logic into a living room, it doesn't always leave politely, and the residue can cling to the walls long after the immediate threat has moved on, and that's where the drama has the potential to go from simply satisfying to genuinely haunting if it has the courage to stay with the aftermath instead of racing to the next adrenaline hit, because the aftermath is where the real story is, and that aftermath, by the way, is where I think the show's structure lives or dies. Because with a premise this punchy, the easiest path is to treat everything like a series of problems you can solve. Threat appears, veterans assemble, threat gets handled, roll into the next complication. That's a functional engine, but it's also a shallow one if you don't add a deeper rhythm underneath it. The deeper rhythm is consequence. The deeper rhythm is, every choice solves one thing and breaks two others. If the veteran's promise understands consequence as its real narrative fuel, it can do something really special with pacing. It can let the action beats feel like spikes in the heart monitor, and the quieter beats feel like the long, trembling line afterward where you're just waiting to see what damage was done. And I know, damage is a loaded word here, so let me be specific. I don't just mean physical harm. I mean trust damage. Identity damage. The kind of damage where a person has to wake up the next morning and pretend they are still the same. There's a version of this story where the veterans show up and the widow is immediately grateful and everything becomes a clean alliance. That's the fantasy version. The more honest version is that gratitude and resentment can sit in the same chest. That she can be relieved and furious. That she can want help and hate what help looks like. And if the show lets her be contradictory like that, it's not making her unlikable. It's making her believable. Here's a question that's been sitting in my head like a pebble in my shoe. Does the lead character ever ask the widow what she wants, or does he just decide? Because the premise is built on decisiveness. One phone call. No hesitation. Mobilization. It's very, we're doing this. And that energy can steamroll the actual people being protected, even if nobody intends it to. So if the show is brave, it will include moments where the widow has to fight for her own autonomy in the middle of being saved. Not against the villains. Against the machine of protection. And to be clear, that doesn't mean the veterans are villains. It means the force they bring is heavy, and heavy things crush delicate things unless someone actively holds them back. But the part that really keeps me leaning forward is when the show potentially turns that into character drama within the group. Imagine a veteran who says, "We're here to protect them," and another veteran responds, "We're here to protect his promise," and suddenly you realize those two men are talking about two different missions. One is about people. The other is about identity. That's where loyalty becomes complicated. Because loyalty can be love, but it can also be possession. It can be devotion, but it can also be ego. It can be the purest thing in the world and still destroy everyone involved if it turns into a substitute for healing. You know what else makes this premise so potent? The fact that it's fundamentally about a phone call. I'm weirdly obsessed with that, because phones in dramas are usually just plot devices. They are just the thing that delivers information. But a phone call here is a ritual. It's a door. It's the moment a character chooses to stop pretending. And there's a lot you can do visually with that. You can shoot the phone like it's a weapon. You can shoot it like it's an anchor. You can emphasize the pause before the call. The way the lead's thumb hovers, the way he inhales, the way he looks around his new life like he's saying goodbye without saying goodbye. If the show lingers on that moment, it's telling you it cares about interiority, not just plot. And if it doesn't linger, if it rushes to the cool assembly moment, it's telling you it cares more about spectacle. Neither is inherently wrong, but one is going to stick with you longer. Something I'd also love the series to explore, and it feels almost inevitable if it's paying attention, is the idea of who gets to be called a hero. The fallen brother is labeled a hero in the premise. The lead is framed as a hero-adjacent figure. The veterans are framed as heroes by association. But heroism is a social label, and social labels always have politics baked into them. Not partisan politics. Human politics. Who we praise, who we forgive, who we fear, who we ignore. So if the show includes even a slight taste of public reaction, media reaction, community reaction, you can get really interesting friction. Maybe some neighbors see the veterans as reassuring. Maybe others see them as a threat. Maybe some people fetishize them. Maybe some people resent them. Maybe the widow becomes a symbol people argue over, which is horrifying, but realistic. And then the story becomes about narrative control. Who gets to tell the story of what's happening? The veterans? The villains? The community? The state? The widow? That's when a simple protection plot becomes a bigger drama about power. Just when you think you know where the emotional center is, that's when a show like this can pull something that recontextualizes everything, not with a cheap twist, but with a shift in perspective. Give me one episode's worth of story told mostly through the widow's eyes, or the daughter's. Not because it's a gimmick, but because it reminds you that the veteran's energy is not the default human experience. It's an intrusion. And I'm not saying the show has to literally do a POV episode. I'm saying it should understand that perspective is part of the tension. Let's talk about the veterans as a collective character for a minute, because that's such a specific storytelling tool. You see it in heist narratives, in vigilante stories, in found family ensembles. The group becomes a character with a personality. The group can be protective. The group can be suspicious. The group can be proud. The group can be wounded. The group can be hungry. And what makes the group compelling is when you see the cracks. When you see that, beneath the solidarity, there are fault lines that will split under enough pressure. The most obvious fault line is method. How far do we go? But there are subtler ones that are even more interesting. Status within the group. Old hierarchies. Old grudges. The guy who always felt overlooked and now sees this mission as a chance to prove himself. The guy who used to be the best and now feels old. The guy who built a stable life and is now risking it because he can't say no. And I'll tell you something I really, really want from this kind of show: let at least one veteran regret answering the call. Not in a melodramatic, I was wrong to help way. In a human way. Like, I thought this would feel like purpose, but it actually feels like I'm becoming someone I don't want to be again. That's not betrayal. That's growth. If the writing is strong, that regret becomes contagious. It spreads quiet doubt through the group. Not enough to make them abandon the widow and child, but enough to create tension. Enough to force conversations they've been avoiding. And those conversations, if you land them, are where your show becomes more than a premise. Now, I want to zoom in on the lead character again, because he's the emotional engine. If he's written as a pure paragon, the show will be emotionally thin. If he's written as a complicated man who sometimes mistakes control for care, the show will have teeth. And yes, I'm going to keep saying that line, because it's the heart of this premise. Control is the shadow of care. A lead like this can be incredibly sympathetic while still being wrong sometimes. And I think audiences are more ready for that than some writers assume. We can love a character and still want them to stop. We can understand why they are doing something and still fear what it's turning them into. That's the space I want the show to live in. So here's a scene type that would sell that arc beautifully. The lead is giving orders. Everything is tight, organized, effective. People are listening. It feels good. And then the widow says something simple like, "Please don't talk like that around my daughter." And he pauses, confused, because in his mind he's being efficient. He's being helpful. He's doing what must be done. But the widow is hearing command language in her home, and she's seeing her child shrink, and she's like, "No. Not here." And in that moment, he has a choice. He can take offense and dig in, because he feels disrespected. Or he can swallow his pride and adapt, because he's here for them, not for his own comfort. That kind of moment doesn't require any external threat. It's just character. And it's also acting, because the actor has to play that flicker of, "I'm right," versus "I'm hurting them," without turning it into a speech. Okay, another angle that could elevate the veteran's promise is if it's willing to depict the veteran's lives outside the mission, even briefly. Show me the guy who leaves the protective perimeter to go to his day job, and he's trying to act normal in a meeting while his phone is buzzing with updates. Show me the guy who has to explain to his partner why he's gone all night again. Show me the guy who is lying to his kid about where he's been because he doesn't know how to explain why he keeps running toward danger. That's what gives the mission weight. Because now it's not just, they show up. It's, they sacrifice. And sacrifice is where drama lives. It's also where moral tension lives, because some of these men might be sacrificing too much, not because the mission requires it, but because they are using the mission as an excuse to avoid their actual lives. And that's uncomfortable. That's also honest. There's also the question of competence. Are they really as organized as the premise implies? 200 people mobilizing isn't automatically effective. It can be chaotic. It can be messy. People have different ideas. People show up with different energy. So if the show wants to be grounded, it should show logistical friction. Not in a boring procedural way, but in a character way. People arguing over what's necessary. People disagreeing over risk. People stepping on each other's toes. The lead trying to maintain authority while also trying not to become a tyrant. And if you want to make that visually compelling, you shoot it like a pressure cooker. Tight frames. Overlapping dialogue. Quick cuts to small details that show anxiety. A cup shaking in someone's hand. A cigarette burning too fast. A man staring at the door like he expects it to explode. Those are the moments that make a show feel alive. Let me pivot to something I haven't touched much yet, romance. Or, more accurately, the possibility of romance and the minefield around it. A lot of dramas with this kind of setup will flirt with the idea of the lead and the widow developing feelings. It's a classic dynamic, protector and protected, shared grief, proximity, emotional intensity. And I'm not against it on principle. But it's risky. If it's done lazily, it feels like the widow is being rewarded with a new man, or like the lead is being given the brother's family as a replacement prize. That's gross. That undermines the whole emotional core. The only way that kind of romance works, for me, is if it's treated with extreme care. It has to be slow. It has to be reluctant. It has to be haunted by the brother's absence in a way that doesn't get magically resolved by a kiss in the rain. And honestly, I think the more interesting move might be to not go there at all, or to keep it as an ache rather than a plot. Let there be intimacy without romance. Let there be tenderness that doesn't require a relationship label. Because grief intimacy is real. Two people can be bonded deeply by loss without it turning into romance. And I think audiences are hungry for that kind of nuance. So if the show avoids the easy romance route, that might actually be my surprising take, I'd respect it more. I know some people would be disappointed. But emotionally, it's cleaner and, in a way, braver. It says, this story isn't here to pair people off. It's here to examine what grief does to love. Now, here's the next rehook. What if the promise itself becomes a trap the lead can't escape even when the widow no longer wants it? Because that's where the title can turn from inspiring to tragic. The promise, at first, is a lifeline. Later, it might become a chain. And the most devastating version of that is if the lead begins to need the promise more than the family does. If keeping it becomes his identity. If breaking it feels like betrayal not just of the brother, but of himself. That's the kind of arc that can break my heart if it's written well. And I'm going to be honest, I'm drawn to stories like that because they are not really about war. They're about compulsion. They're about the way people cling to purpose when they don't know who they are without it. Now let's get into what the show might be saying, under the surface, about community and vengeance. The premise's tone, especially that last line, has a vigilante flavor. It's basically like, try it and see what happens. And as an audience, we're trained to enjoy that. We're trained to see it as justice. But justice and vengeance are cousins who look alike in bad lighting. So if the show is thoughtful, it will create moments where that line blurs. Moments where a character realizes they're enjoying the intimidation too much. Moments where someone escalates not because it's necessary, but because it feels good to be feared again. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's not an accusation. It's a psychological reality. Power can be intoxicating, especially if you've felt powerless in other areas of your life. So if the veterans have been ignored, discarded, undersupported, that's fertile ground for a story about how easily righteous protection can turn into righteous domination. The show doesn't have to demonize anyone to explore that. It just has to be honest about temptation. And this is where sound and music can do subtext. If the score treats intimidation scenes like triumph, you're telling the audience to cheer. If the score treats them like something uneasy, if it brings in dissonance, if it uses lower tones, if it emphasizes breath and silence, you're telling the audience to question. The show's moral stance can be heard, not just seen. Same with cinematography. Hero shots versus surveillance shots. Warm lighting versus cold. Low angles that glorify versus eye level that humanizes. Shallow depth of field that isolates characters versus wide shots that show the crowd, the scale, the potential for chaos. These are not neutral choices. Okay, I want to spend time on the widow now, because I think she's the character that determines whether the show has genuine emotional maturity. If she's written as a passive recipient of protection, the show becomes a male fantasy of heroism. If she's written as someone with agency, sharp instincts, and complicated feelings about being surrounded by these men, the show becomes a drama. And not just any drama. A drama about what it means to be a woman carrying grief in a world that wants to turn that grief into a story for men. Let her be angry at her husband for dying. Let her be angry at the lead for showing up too late, even if that's unfair. Let her be angry at the veterans for treating her home like an outpost. Let her be grateful anyway. Let her feel guilty for being grateful. Let her feel ashamed for wishing, in a dark moment, that the threat would just go away so she could grieve in peace. Those are real feelings. They don't make her bad. They make her human. And when you put a human widow next to a lead character who is operating out of guilt and obligation, you get a relationship that is charged without needing romance. You get a relationship that is basically a negotiation between two kinds of grief. His guilt grief. Her loss grief. Different beasts. I also want to talk about the daughter again, because child characters in serious dramas are hard. If she's written too cute, it cheapens the tone. If she's written too wise, it feels fake. If she's written too invisible, the stakes feel abstract. The sweet spot is making her observant and inconsistent, like a real kid. Sometimes she's playful. Sometimes she's withdrawn. Sometimes she says something blunt that cuts through adult denial. Sometimes she regresses, gets clingy, gets angry. And most importantly, let her have her own relationship to her father's hero label. Kids don't always feel proud. Sometimes they feel burdened by the way adults talk about the dead like they belong to everyone. If the daughter has a moment where she snaps and says something like, "He was my dad," that's not just a sad line. That's a theme statement. It's the show saying, stop turning the dead into property. That line, by the way, would destroy me. I'm not even pretending I'd be cool about it. And yes, that's another personal confession. I'm a sucker for stories that explore how kids get forced into adult narratives. It gets under my skin. It makes me protective in a way that's almost embarrassing. Like I become the grandma on the couch yelling at the TV, "Leave that child alone," even though I'm alone in my room. So if the show pushes that angle, it's going to have me in a chokehold. Now, let's look at the title again, because titles are promises too. The Veteran's Promise. Singular. Not promises. Not oath. Not brotherhood. Singular. That suggests the show wants us to fixate on one central vow, one central commitment that everything spirals around. And I think that's a good framing, because it keeps the story emotionally coherent even as the plot escalates. But it also means the show needs to define what the promise actually is. Is it, "I'll keep them safe"? Is it, "I'll make sure your sacrifice meant something"? Is it, "I'll never leave your family behind"? Is it, I'll punish the people responsible? Those are different promises, and they lead to different outcomes. A promise of safety might lead to evacuation, relocation, quiet protection. A promise of meaning might lead to public exposure, martyr narratives, political confrontation. A promise of punishment leads to revenge logic. If the show keeps the promise ambiguous, it can feel muddy. If it clarifies it, it can feel inevitable. And inevitability, in a tragedy sense, can be delicious. Because then you start watching not to see what happens, but to see how it happens. How a man talks himself into crossing lines. How a group justifies its escalation. How a widow tries to protect her child not just from villains, but from the kind of protection that changes her child's soul. That's heavy. That's compelling. Here's another thing that could make the show land emotionally: show the veterans being protective of each other, not just the family. That's the thing about group trauma. People become siblings. They become substitutes. They become the only ones who understand. So let's say a veteran in the group starts slipping. Maybe he's drinking again. Maybe he's getting reckless. Maybe he's talking too much about wanting the villains to feel it. If the group rallies around him, not in a macho, shake it off way, but in a real, we're not losing you way, that's where the brotherhood becomes something more than a weapon. And it also complicates the moral picture, because now you're not just watching a group capable of violence. You're watching a group capable of care. And when a group can do both, it becomes harder to judge them. You can't just label them. You have to feel them. That's what good drama does. It makes you hold two truths at once. Now, I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. A show like this can attract two very different audiences. One audience wants catharsis and justice and intimidation. They want, don't mess with the innocent. Another audience wants complexity and critique and character tragedy. They want, what does violence do to the people who use it? And the show can serve both, but it has to be careful. If it tries to please everyone, it can end up saying nothing. If it commits to complexity, some viewers will call it slow or preachy. If it commits to pure catharsis, some viewers will call it shallow. So the best possible outcome is a show that delivers catharsis while planting discomfort inside that catharsis. You get your satisfying moments, but they have aftertaste. Like, yes, the villains should feel pressure. Yes, the family should be protected. But if the show is honest, those victories should come with a price tag someone has to look at. And it doesn't always have to be a huge dramatic consequence. Sometimes the consequence is as simple as the daughter flinching when a man raises his voice, even if he isn't yelling at her. Sometimes the consequence is the widow realizing she can't sleep without hearing footsteps outside, and when the veterans eventually leave, the silence feels unsafe. Sometimes the consequence is the lead character standing in his rebuilt life afterward and realizing he doesn't fit in it anymore because he just remembered how to be a soldier. That last one? That's the kind of ending energy that would make the show linger in my mind for weeks. I'm not saying that's what happens. I'm saying that's what the premise is begging for. The premise is begging for a story where, answering the call, is not just a heroic act, but a doorway you can't fully close behind you. Okay, I want to talk about something lighter for a second, but still meaningful: humor. Not jokes like sitcom jokes, but the kind of gallows humor and camaraderie that real people use to survive tension. If the show is too humorless, it can feel self-serious. If it's too jokey, it can feel disrespectful. The sweet spot is small, human moments. A veteran complaining about how civilian coffee tastes like sadness. Someone making a dumb pun at the worst time. Two guys arguing about the best route like it's a life or death thing and then realizing they are arguing because they are scared. Those moments aren't filler. They are character. And they also make the darker scenes hit harder, because when you laugh with someone, you care about them. Here's a rehook that I think would keep viewers glued: what if the greatest threat isn't the villains at all, but the veterans' inability to stop once they've started? That's the real suspense of a vigilante-adjacent story. Not, can they win, but, can they stop winning in the wrong way? If the show even gestures toward that question, it becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a meditation on power. And power is always the hidden subject in stories like this. The power to hurt. The power to protect. The power to define what justice is. The power to decide who counts as innocent. Which brings me to another potential layer. What if the antagonists are not cleanly evil? What if they have a grievance? What if they think they're the ones owed a promise? Now, I'm not advocating for sympathetic villains as a rule. Sometimes villains are just cruel. But when you have a story built on promises and loyalty, it's interesting if the opposition also claims loyalty to their own cause. Because then you're not just watching good versus evil. You're watching two groups who both think they're justified collide, and the collateral is the widow and child. That's messy, but it's real-world messy. Now, I want to return to the idea of 200, because numbers in storytelling are symbols. 200 is not just a head count. It's an image. It's mass. It's a wave. And a wave doesn't just hit the target. It floods everything around it. So the show should understand that scale as a metaphor. The past doesn't come back as one memory. It comes back as a crowd. It comes back as a whole identity system reactivating. That's why the mobilization is such a good metaphor for relapse. Again, not addiction specifically, but relapse into an old self. You think you've moved on. Then one crisis happens, and suddenly the old network lights up, and the old habits feel right again, and you're back in it before you even notice. That's relatable in a scary way. And it's also where the editing can mirror psychology. Faster cuts as the lead gets more consumed. Tighter frames as his world narrows. Color grading shifting colder. The domestic space is losing warmth. If the show has that kind of visual arc, you can feel the story in your body. Okay, I'm going to take another self-aware aside, because I can feel myself getting intense. This is the part where, if I was actually filming, I'd probably take a sip of water and stare at the camera like, "Are you still with me?" Because I know not everyone wants to hear me talk about color temperature like it's a moral argument. But listen, this is why we're here. This is the stuff that makes a show hit or not hit. Anyway, let's talk about the emotional payoff that a story like this should aim for, without spoiling any specific endgame. The emotional payoff shouldn't just be, family is safe. Safety is the baseline. The emotional payoff should be transformation. The widow should not end the story the same person she started as. Not because she becomes a warrior, but because she learns something about her own boundaries and strength. She learns how to demand agency even in crisis. The daughter should not end the story unchanged. Again, not because she becomes hardened, but because she understands something about adults and fear and love that she didn't want to learn yet. The goal is not to traumatize her for drama points, but to acknowledge that events like this leave fingerprints. The lead should not end the story unchanged. He should either integrate his soldier self into his civilian self in a healthier way, or he should fail to do so and become a warning. And the veterans as a group should not end unchanged. They should either disperse with more understanding of themselves, or they should remain activated, which is ominous. If the show hits those arcs, it earns its length. It earns its intensity. If it doesn't, it risks being a series of cool moments without a soul. One more thing I want to highlight is the opportunity for the show to explore intergenerational trauma, even lightly. The veterans carry trauma. The widow carries grief. The daughter is absorbing both. She's learning what love looks like under threat. She's learning what men look like when they are protective. She's learning what promise means in a world where promises can't resurrect the dead. And whether the show intends it or not, that becomes a story about what gets passed down. Not just stories of heroism, but behaviors. Hypervigilance. Suspicion. The belief that safety comes from force. If the show is aware of that, it can treat the daughter not just as someone to protect, but as someone whose future worldview is being shaped in real time. That's heavy, but it's also the kind of layer that makes dramas worth talking about. Alright. Let's get even more specific about what threatened can mean, because not all threats are equal in storytelling, and the kind of threat shapes the show's tone. A physical threat creates immediate tension and action. A legal threat creates paranoia and moral frustration. A social threat, like smear campaigns or isolation, creates slow dread. A psychological threat, like stalking or manipulation, creates intimate horror. A show like The Veteran's Promise can actually weave multiple types of threat, escalating from one to another, which keeps the story from becoming repetitive. But again, the show has to be careful not to just stack threats like levels in a game. The threats need to feel like they're pressuring the character's internal flaws. If the lead's flaw is control, the threat should tempt him to control more. If the widow's flaw is isolation, the threat should tempt her to withdraw. If the daughter's flaw is fear, the threat should tempt her to become numb. That's when plot and character braid together. And this is where I'm going to say something that might be unpopular. I don't actually need the villains to be worse than the veterans for the show to work. A lot of action narratives feel like they have to make the antagonists cartoonishly evil so the protagonists can do anything and still be the good guys. But a mature drama doesn't need that. A mature drama can let the protagonist's choices be morally risky even if the antagonists are merely threatening, not monstrous. Because the point isn't to justify everything. The point is to explore what people do under pressure. So if the show resists the urge to escalate villain cruelty just to justify protagonist brutality, that's a sign of confidence in the writing. And I know some viewers will disagree. Some viewers want the villains to be irredeemable so they can enjoy the catharsis without guilt. I get that. But I personally think the guilt is the interesting part. The guilt is where the show becomes art instead of content. Okay, I want to live for a moment in the space of, what does a promise sound like? Because dialogue matters here. A promise isn't just the words, I promise. It's the tone. It's the way someone speaks when they're making a vow they intend to die for. If the lead character makes his promise in a big dramatic speech, it can feel cheesy. If he makes it in a quiet sentence, almost like he's confessing, it can feel devastating. The best promises in dramas are the ones that sound like resignation. Like the character already knows what it's going to cost, and they say it anyway. And that's why I want the lead's vocal performance to be restrained. Let him sound like a man trying not to break. Let him sound like someone who is choosing to carry pain because the alternative is unbearable. That's the kind of performance that can make a line like, I've got you, feel like a knife. There's also the potential for recurring motifs. Maybe the show uses a specific phrase that the fallen brother used to say, and now the veterans repeat it like a mantra. That can be powerful, but it can also be chilling if it becomes a justification phrase. If every time someone questions a decision, someone says the phrase, and the room shuts down, that's the show showing you how rituals can replace thinking. And that's another theme, the danger of slogans. The danger of turning grief into a chant. If the series goes there, it has a real point of view. Now, I'm aware we're spending a lot of time in the psychological and thematic lane, so let me swing back to what a lot of people will be watching for, tension and action. Action in a drama like this should not be constant. If it is constant, it becomes noise. The best action is action that reveals character. A scuffle that shows who escalates. A chase that shows who panics. A confrontation that shows who can't stop once they start. And also, the best action scenes are the ones where you feel the characters thinking. Not in a cheesy, in a monologue way, but in performance and blocking. A man hesitating before he throws the first punch because he knows the punch will change everything. A man stepping between someone and violence, not because he's physically strong, but because he's morally strong. If the show can make an action beat into a moral beat, it levels up. And if it can't, if action is just spectacle, it might still entertain, but it won't deepen. Here's another rehook that I think the show's premise naturally invites. What if the lead's promise begins to conflict with the widow's promise to her daughter? Because the widow has a promise too, whether she says it or not. Her promise is, I will keep you safe and give you a life. And if the lead's mission endangers that life, even if it keeps them alive in the short term, you get conflict that isn't villain-driven. It's love-driven. Those are the best conflicts. Conflicts where everyone has a point, and everyone is scared. If the show reaches that territory, it's going to generate the kind of scenes people clip and argue about for weeks. And yeah, speaking of arguing, this is a show that could absolutely set fandom on fire, because anything involving heroes, families, deserved protection, and vigilante energy invites moral debate. People will pick sides. People will write think pieces. People will reduce complex characters to good and bad. It happens every time. So friends, that's for today. Now if you liked the video, please subscribe the channel Bongo Gaming and press the bell icon. Thank you.